Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to March's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting presentation. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to join the stream before we get things started. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for joining today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to give our friends just a few more minutes to join the stream, and then we're going to get things going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maddie McCauley, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department here at Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and Maryland 4th Century Project. Before we get things started, I'd like to indicate that should you have any questions or comments for today's presenter, please enter them into the comment or chat box below the video, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archives. Take it away, Owen.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Owen Lurie. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Maryland State Archives. The State Archives holds records of permanent value of the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. These Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity to hear the stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives in uncovering shared heritage. Our presentation today comes from Savannah G.M. Wood and is entitled Preserving the Afro News Archives, about the holdings of the Afro American newspaper, which are voluminous and amazing, as well as their new archive building. If you are interested in exploring our records for your own research, I hope that you will come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. I hope that you'll also join us next month on April 10th, when Norris Howard Jr., Pocomoke Council member and tradition bearer, will speak on the history of the Pocomoke Indian Nation. You can find a full list of programs, including videos of past presentations, on our website. And of course, you can find many more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. And now to introduce our speaker, here's Ruth Foundation, founding director of the Maryland 4th Centuries Project.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome all to our almost spring and pre-Maryland Day Lunch and Learn lecture. Maryland has two very, very special holidays all its own. The first is on March 25th, and that's the 391st birthday of Maryland. That's when the English settlers celebrated Mass on St. Clement's Island in the Potomac River. The other is when Baltimore saved the nation in 1814 in September, and that is known as Defender's Day. So celebrate Maryland. As always, we are working with our partners, the Andy Pratt Library and the Maryland State Archives, to consistently present why the history of our state and the nation is important to all of us. Because we emphasize how our history relates to us today, we have created the Maryland Mosaic for 2026. As we approach our country's 250th birthday, we have joined with the state's 250th Commission to reach out to all 23 counties and Baltimore City. The Mosaic is 150 people, places, events, documents, objects, and structures that are historic firsts, both here and most especially in the entire nation. These firsts fit together to create a rich and rewarding 250-year Maryland portrait. Our small state, number 43 in size, has a very, very big story to tell. And you can see the complete mosaic at www.marylandmosaic, that's one word, .org. The mosaic history of Maryland includes 12 generations since 1776. More than ever today, it is essential that we keep our past alive in us. We are lucky to live in a state that is still committed to telling our complete story, the memorable moments along with challenges and missteps that continue to vex us. We own all of it. It is understanding the past with all of its trials and tribulations that helps us face the future. History gives us a backbone. We welcome all of our audience during this fraught moment in our nation's history. Help us keep a spotlight on the importance of the last 250 years. We owe this dedication to the truth, not only to the past generations, but more than ever to our descendants. And the important story we will hear today fits perfectly into maintaining the value of that truth. We are proud that the AFRO newspaper is included in the Maryland Mosaic. The 133-year history of Baltimore's African American newspaper is an inspiring story, not only for the city and the state, but for the whole country. We are inspired by John Murphy, a Marylander who was born enslaved and freed as a veteran of the Civil War with the U.S. colored troops. He created a newspaper for African Americans in the 1890s. The Jim Crow era was in full force. The 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, made segregation the law of the land. We are inspired because the popular AFRO newspaper not only survived, but continues to fight for civil rights after 5 generations of Murphy family ownership. Today, it proudly remains the oldest continuous newspaper for African Americans in the U.S. And we are inspired to have our speaker today to tell us about another important moment in the history of the AFRO. Savannah G.M. Wood, an honored artist with Baltimore roots, heads the Afro Charities Foundation. She is working hard to restore a Baltimore landmark. The 1838 Upton Mansion will soon have a new life as the permanent home of the Afro American Newspaper Archive. We are again inspired that the very complete 133-year-old history of that newspaper will soon be available to the public in a wonderful restored setting for researchers and educators alike. Please join me with a hearty welcome to Savannah G.M. Wood.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I feel like we could leave it there if we needed to. Hi, everybody. My name is Savannah G.M. Wood. I'm going to share some slides with you coming up in just a moment to give backstory a little bit about myself, as well as the newspaper company and the work that Afro Charities is now doing to steward this collection. So give me just a moment to share my screen. Okay. As I mentioned, I am executive director of Afro Charities Incorporated. This is a sister company to the historic Afro American Newspapers Company, and it was founded in 1963 in Baltimore. It is a nonprofit organization that was founded initially to take on some of the Afro's charitable programs, including Afro Clean Block, which many people know of and participated in Baltimore as an annual cleanup event, primarily for school children during the summer, and Mrs. Santa, which was an annual gift drive for children during the holiday season. Since 1963, those have been the main two programs of Afro Charities, but within the past 5.5 years, we have expanded Afro Charities' reach to include care for the historic Afro archives, which we'll talk about momentarily. I want to share a bit of background about how I got into archival work. The images that you see here are from Chicago when I used to work at the Rebuild Foundation, which was founded by Theaster Gates, who's the guy standing up front there. He is an artist, most known as an artist, but also did a lot of work with interesting collections of archives from University of Chicago's Art History Department. On the right, you'll see objects that were collected by a couple in Chicago over 40 years. It was racist articles primarily that they were trying to take out of circulation. They realized that was an act in futility and ended up instead amassing a huge collection that was reflecting back to America its own ideas about Black people. And once they wanted to downsize, they found Theaster and he took on that whole collection. So my introduction to archival work was primarily through processing that collection, which was very interesting, to say the least. But it also introduced me to the power of archival description and how that really affects whether or not you're able to find objects, depending on how you describe them. So it gave me insight into how metadata shapes accessibility and discoverability in archives. From there, I moved back to Los Angeles, where I worked with an organization called Clock Shop, again, an arts organization in this case, but they were just embarking on a project to work with Octavia E. Butler's archives at the Huntington Library. She's a science fiction writer who's from Pasadena, California, which is where my family, half of my family is from. And so it was a really interesting project where we invited creative artists and creative writers to spend time with Octavia Butler's collections and to make new work inspired by what they found there. And in that role, I was able to serve as essentially an on-the-ground researcher for the artists and writers who couldn't spend quite as much time in the collections, as well as co-editor of the publication that you see at top right, and co-producer of a podcast that we created in conjunction with this year-long program. So again, this was a way of creatively exploring archives, and it was, I guess, a second introduction, if you will, a second look into archival research for me, which got me thinking about my family's newspaper company in Baltimore and whether or not we actually had archives, which I soon learned that we did. So the Afro American Newspaper Company was founded in Baltimore in 1892, as we heard earlier, and our family has owned it actually since 1897. This building on North Utah Street used to be the Afro's headquarters for about 80 years. So you'll see if you go to our Instagram page, we're also lobbying to get this put on a new edition of Monopoly that is a Baltimore-focused one. So find that and vote for us on that. But this site was really important for a lot of reasons. This is a representation of the expansion of the newspaper company at the time, and then a long-standing cultural hub where Black journalism thrived, but also community projects were based out of this site. These are my great-great-grandparents, John Henry Murphy Sr. on the left and Martha Elizabeth Howard Murphy on the right. It was actually Martha's initial investment of $200 that allowed our family to purchase the Afro name and printing press at an auction. And there's a very interesting story about how she came into that money, which we might get to later if there's questions about it. I'd be happy to talk about it later, but both of them were born enslaved in Maryland and then ended up owning this company that has become an iconic resource for not only Black Baltimore, but really the entire nation. And particularly now we see how important the work that they did is to people who are doing scholarship now. Within that building that we showed you, we see the evolution of so many different technologies as it relates to print production. So everything happened in a vertically integrated way at that site for decades. So there were people who were doing the typesetting in there, the writers were in there, journalists are there, the editors are there, the marketing team is there. Everybody is in that building working together to produce this paper. There were 13 editions of the Afro at one point in several different cities. And so Baltimore is the headquarters and the base, but we had outposts in Washington, D.C., which we still do today, in Richmond, Virginia, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Newark, New Jersey. And I think I might be forgetting one. If I am, I'll circle back to it. But there was, a weekly edition that would come out maybe twice a week. And then there was a weekend occasionally. So there were several different editions that were produced, a national edition as well. A lot of that was printed directly in Baltimore. So the archives, as you might imagine, cover a huge amount of information. We estimate that there are about 3 million photographs in this collection. And the content of the photographs really varies. So for instance, you'll see national events like this one of Marian Anderson singing on the National Mall, but you'll also see moments of daily life for Black people, not only in Baltimore, but as I mentioned, all up and down the Eastern Seaboard and in fact abroad as well. So Afro Charities, we are, as I mentioned, a nonprofit organization. And within the past 5.5 years, we have taken on the monumental task of caring for the Afro's historic archives and importantly, making them more accessible to the public. The collections are incredibly rich. I mentioned the 3 million photographs that we're estimating in the collection, but there's so much more than the photographs that are there as well. In the image on the left, you'll notice this is essentially how the collection has been filed away. It's primarily under subject headings. Nation of Islam is one that's poking up there, National Council of Negro Women. So there's subject files. So if you're looking for materials, you would search under the organization, a person's name, an event that might have taken place. That's the way that you would find the materials in the collection. In addition to these files, we also have some audiovisual materials. In the center, you'll see a reel-to-reel that just says Martin Luther King speech on it. That was in a box tucked away. And then on the right, you'll notice a political cartoon by Thomas Stockett, who worked with the Afro for approximately 40 years. And we have 2 filing cabinets that are completely full of his original cartoons, which is a gift. And as you can tell, a lot of the cartoons actually are still relevant today, which just tells you about where we are, how far we have come or not. What I think is really special about this collection is that many of the photographs have really rich details on the backs that tell us a lot about what's happening within the image. These are production files, right? So the photographs were made generally pretty quickly. So you'll also notice on some of them, there are hand touched up details, kind of like an analog Photoshop, where Thomas Stockett, who we heard of earlier, the cartoonist, would go in and actually outline people, white out some of the background. And really that was so that it would reproduce better in the actual newspaper and pop more. But what you'll notice on the back here, it says Lillian Payne, Captain. Both backs and fronts of these homes have been cleaned. This is a small street, but it is clean and decorated with beautiful flowers, over 50 workers. So this was from Clean Block campaign, which is the charitable program that I mentioned that the Afro newspaper company founded in 1934, and that Afro Charities took on after it was founded in 1963. So this image is documenting the Clean Block campaign and this beautiful block that was cleaned up by Miss Lillian Payne, captain of the block, and her 50 workers who are working with her. What we can do with this is when we digitize these images, which is a project that we initiated and that we will be circling back to shortly, is we're actually able to use an AI plugin through Google Vision to read the backs of the images and to pull those captions out into text that we can search and edit. So this is a staging database using Airtable that our lead archivist, Megan McShay, created. And you'll notice there are lots of images in here. We note which edition it was published in, if it was published. If we have the photographer's name, we'll add that in there. We say whether or not it was an Afro photo or not. It might have been created by somebody else. And then what we'll see in a moment is on the right-hand side, there's this OCR text, optical character recognition, and below that, object recognition. So that's the Google Vision plugin reading the back of the image and pulling that data out. So what that does is, in addition to the folder information that we have that you saw in that initial image of the file cabinet, we have, of course, that subject heading, but then we have much more detail beneath it. So for instance, in the image of Lillian Payne, that probably was not filed under her name. It was probably filed under Clean Block. And so if you were going to look for Lillian Payne, you wouldn't be able to find her unless we had already digitized that image and we knew where she was, right? So by digitizing the backs of these images and using AI to read the backs, we're able to then surface that information so we can search for Lillian Payne and then find that photograph in a Clean Block file. So that's what the benefit of digitization is for us, in addition to just making these images more accessible to the public in the future. Now, I mentioned that this was a project that we picked up and then put back down for a moment. So this was all made during a pilot digitization project that we did. And we have it set up and ready to go, ready to pick back up once we move into our new home. But before we get to our new home, we have quite a bit of work to do to organize the physical files. And so we have a processing team that is going through the general files of the collections and updating all of that data. As they're updating the data, as they're rearranging the folders, making them more searchable and more easily accessible internally, they're also uploading that new data to our archive space instance, which is publicly available and searchable. So this is just a quick look into some of the work that they've done so far. They're going letter by letter, not in alphabetical order, but in their own idiosyncratic order that makes sense for their team. And you'll see on the right-hand side the letters that they've completed so far. So E, I, K, L, N, O, Q, R, U, V, X, Y, and Z, as well as some Afro subjects that are listed there as well. And the Afro subjects are programs that were created by the Afro, such as the Ideal Mother Contest, the Cooking School and Home Show, Mrs. Santa, Afro Clean Block, Newsies. These are subject files that we think people might be interested in as a whole. So we're pulling some of those and describing them as well. So the point of this processing project is really to get the collection super well organized and documented in advance of opening our public research center where people can come and do research themselves in person. And what this helps us do as we're rearranging the files within the collection, it means that if you were looking for Malcolm X, like the first thing that I typed in, the way that the collection was organized before, you might have had 15 files on him that were spread out in 5 different boxes, let's say. So what they're doing is actually pulling all of those X boxes off the shelf, pulling all the Malcolm X files, well, all of the files, and rearranging them into an actual alphabetical order so that those 15 folders on Malcolm X would then be situated in one box. So when somebody comes and requests the material that we have on him, it would all be within one box and we only have to pull one as opposed to 5. So that's the goal with this processing project in advance of opening our public research center. I brought this photo in here just to highlight one of our processing fellows, now turned independent processing archivist, Jasmine Clark, who's up front here. And she came to Afro Charities with not much experience working within archives, but through a program that was funded with a federal earmark, we were able to train she and Bilfina Yawan, who's our other processing fellow turned processing archivist, in archival processing work. So we have a lead archivist, Megan McShay, who's been on the team since about 2021. And she designed both the database that we talked about earlier for digitization, but also the workflow for processing, and then trained both Jasmine and Bilfina in that work to be able to work independently to move through this collection to help it get ready for the public. So in the process, they're learning valuable skills about archival work, and then are actually able to share that out. So the other people that you see in this image were from last year's cohort of the New Generation Scholars, which is a youth program founded by Muse 360, a Baltimore-based organization that we've partnered with now for 3 years to do a youth artist at archival fellowship that is partially hosted at our site, in our archives at the Maryland State Archives. So this image is at the Maryland State Archives, not in the Annapolis location, but in a separate offsite facility where the collections are currently stored. So I have to give a little shout out to Maryland State Archives for hosting us today, and also for hosting us physically in person at their offsite facility to do this work. I mentioned the youth fellowship that we're doing. This was actually Afro Charities' first year of doing this with students from Coppin Academy. This was before we started partnering with New Generation Scholars, and you'll see Assistant State Archivist Corey Lewis here talking about the Maryland State Archives collection, and then students from that cohort doing their own research, finding files within the Afro archives. So down this whole aisle here, this is all archival material from the Afro News collection. And just like you saw in that filing cabinet earlier, these are folders that are within those boxes. So basically all of these folders are filled like that with materials from the collections. And there's about 2.5 aisles worth of materials that we have that are there. It's about 1,200 linear feet plus some. So in addition to caring for the archives directly, we're also doing some interesting and innovative projects inspired by the collections. So I mentioned earlier my work with the Los Angeles-based organization Clock Shop, where we invited artists and writers into Octavia Butler's archives to make new work. And similarly, here at Afro Charities, we've done a project over the past, I guess, 5.5 years. We're in our 3rd iteration now, where we have invited contemporary artists into the Afro archives to make new work inspired by their research. So this is our first iteration that debuted in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic and the lockdown. So instead of doing an in-person physical exhibition, we ended up projecting the artist's work onto the facade of the former Afro building on North Charles Street, which is now the Deutsch Foundation. So this is a video piece, a still from a video piece by the artist Akia Brion. And this is a still from Shan Wallace. Our next iteration of artist commissions was with a New York-based artist named Zyveria Simmons, and we did this in partnership with an organization called Cadist that is based both in San Francisco and in Paris. And so her exhibition of new work, which you can see behind her here, incorporates images from the Afro archives in new photographs that she's made with this character and different surroundings that she's created. So this debuted in an exhibition at Cadist's headquarters in Paris, and then traveled from there to Stockholm. And ultimately, we'd love to bring this back to Baltimore. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to do that next. But I want to have a piece of her work in our new building. So we're working on it. This is another installation shot, so you can get a sense of what it looked like in there. And through projects like this, we're able to open up new conversations about archival practices and creative approaches to that. So in the context of Zyveria's show in Paris, we convened Black archivists from across Europe and the UK to talk about their different strategies for sustaining, building, and funding their own archival initiatives. So we had people there from London, from Stockholm, from the Netherlands, and from Paris. I'm trying to remember where exactly in the Netherlands Julian was from. I think he might have been from Amsterdam, but I can't remember at this time. But basically, we had all different levels of institutionality, if you will. So there's people who are working on smaller digital-only initiatives, online-only initiatives. There are people who are building physical spaces. And then Rhoda, who's here speaking, was representing the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, which has been standing for more than 40 years and is a true institution in that city. And so various levels of funding, various strategies for funding for different kinds of public programs, but there was a lot of really interesting dialogue that emerged from these creative ideas of exploring archives. This is our current cohort of creative artists who are working in the Afro Archives. You have Glenda Richardson, Sanaa Brown Bowers, and Jason Patterson. So they're in the midst of their research now, and their work will debut next year, at the end of next year, in our new building. So we decided to have them be the inaugural artists to show in that space. And so they'll have a little bit of extra time, more than everybody else before them, to create their works, which I hope will help them do very deep research and to create something that they're really proud of. So beyond the creative artists, contemporary artists work that we're doing in terms of exhibitions, we also do just straight historical exhibitions. This just opened at the Miller Senate building, and this was in collaboration with the Maryland State Archives as well. So Dion Moses, who is Afro Charities Director of Programs and Partnerships, laid out a beautiful display for a vitrine that's at the Senate building that is on view until December 31st and features images from the Afro Archives, an image of some doors that we acquired that were historic and on that old building at North Utah Street, a bound volume of the newspapers, typewriter, and other objects that tell the story of the newspaper and of Afro Charities. And so the objects that are in this display case will likely rotate during the year, but for now, this is what it looks like. And you can come back several times if you want to go to Annapolis to go check it out. So in addition to exhibitions, we've also worked on publications. This one came out in 2020, and it was a celebration of Black women's contributions to the suffrage movement. So 2020 is the year that we were honoring 100 years of women's suffrage and the successful passage of the 19th Amendment. And so what we did was we reached into the archives to highlight Black women from both Maryland and DC who played a role in this work, wrote some short biographies of them. And we also connected the historical information to contemporary pushes, I guess, for voting rights or activism for voting rights today, and reflected also on people who study this work. So Dr. Martha Jones was graciously agreed to be interviewed for this publication. And so there's a great interview with her in there talking about her book, Vanguard, which came out, I believe, that year as well as some articles from the archives that talk about women's suffrage specifically. So with all of this work that we're doing, we're always trying to bring the history into the present in ways that are interesting to people and that allow for various access points into the history. So one of the ways that we do that is by going out into different community spaces and talking about the archives there. So this is, again, Dion Moses, our Director of Programs and Partnerships, speaking at a church in Sandy Spring, Maryland, about the Afro's history and sharing the collections with the public there. So we'll often bring some of these materials out when we go so people can see them and have a better understanding of what is within this collection and how they might access them. Oftentimes during these types of presentations, it's a bit more of a workshop. So Dion will also walk people through how they can have remote access to the collections. And one of the main ways that we steer people to do that is actually through the Enoch Pratt Library, where if you have a library card, you can access back issues of the digitized Afro newspaper going all the way back to 1893. And you can do a keyword search. So you can search whatever you want. And using optical character recognition, it will surface articles that are related to your search topics. You can narrow it down by date. You can narrow it down by articles that only have images with them, front pages only. You have a lot of options there. So if you're interested in that, we can share some resources after this talk. But we also are happy to do that kind of workshop for your organization. We do charge fees to be able to keep this work going, but they're usually on a sliding scale and pretty reasonable for people to be able to have us come out. And I'm moving quickly through these slides, but this is the most exciting part right now for me. On February 28th, we actually broke ground on this project, which is very, 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 very exciting. So the Upton Mansion, as we heard at the very top, is a historic building in Baltimore. It's a Baltimore City landmark. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It was built in 1838 and has served as a private residence. It was Baltimore's second radio station, WCAO. It was also the Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts, which was a music conservatory that opened specifically because Peabody would not allow Black students to attend. And so there's a rich music history at this site. And finally, it was the Upton School before it was left vacant in 2006. And so this site has had a really dynamic history as a residence, as a site for media production, as a site for artistic training and production, as well as for education. And so our redevelopment of this site aims to bring all of those uses back. We'll have the Afro American Newspaper Company moving in as our anchor tenant. We will be doing all of the programs that you saw before. So the youth fellowship that we're doing in partnership with News 360, that will transfer over primarily to this site when they do their research in the collections. Our artist commissioning projects will happen here. As I mentioned before, the 3 artists that we're working with now will have their exhibition debut in the gallery on this site. And what else? Education's definitely happening in here every day. So we're really looking forward to this project being built and welcoming everybody to come and see the collections, to see the building, and to experience this history that we know is really life-changing. What else can I say about this building briefly? We worked with Zigger Sneed Architects on the design, and commercial construction is leading the construction currently. One of the things that I think is really beautiful is Zigger Sneed did this kind of fold on the side here that's meant to mimic newspapers coming off of a press. So we saw that image earlier of newspapers coming off of the press, and that was what they were going for there. And this kind of gray tone that's here is a little metallic that is meant to kind of imitate the printing plates that were used to actually print photographs within the collection. So when you come in, we'll be able to describe all of those things to you on site, and you'll be able to actually see some of those physical materials to understand those references more clearly as well. So we know this is a really significant project, not only for Baltimore, but really for the country. And we look forward to welcoming people to this site to understand the history. This is an image from our groundbreaking just 2 weeks ago. And then I have to shout out our amazing team who make it all happen. So this is Afro Charities core team from left to right, Oyinda Omoloja, who is primarily the person who will be fielding your research requests if you write in. So she's our reference archivist, our archives assistant. Jasmine Clark, who you saw before, processing archivist. Megan McShay, lead archivist on the team. Myself, I'm executive director. Dion Moses, director of programs and partnerships. And Amber Campbell Wheeler, who's our programs coordinator. And finally, Bilfina Yowan, who is our other processing archivist on the team. So we anticipate we'll need to expand, obviously, to serve people when we're on this site. But this is an amazing team to start with. So we wouldn't be able to do half of what we do without them. And I think that's it for me for right now. I hope there are some questions to respond to because there's quite a bit of information and I'd love to talk with you more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savannah. That was a lovely presentation, and we have had a very lively chat. So I am very excited to share questions and comments with you. I'm going to kick us off actually with a comment question that was so that we give an opportunity to others to kind of chime in. Someone said that they would love to learn more about your great grandmother. So that'll give folks an opportunity to kind of put some more questions in if they have them now.
Okay, great. I'll start with that. I know I always give a little teaser, but I'll give you the backstory. So it's a story that I find to be really fascinating, and I've been slowly working on a short film about this story. So I'm incorporating that into my own personal artistic practice now. But the backstory that I've always heard is that my great-great-grandmother gave her husband $200 to start this newspaper company. That would be about $7,000 today. So you have to imagine these people born enslaved, where do you have $7,000 to just give your husband for this dream? What? That's crazy. So in looking for other things in the collections, not even looking for that, I came across a box in the archives that was a different shape from the rest of them, and opened it and found this scrapbook in there that had my great-great-grandmother's obituary in it. And her photo's right in the middle. And it's all of this great information about her life. And in the obituary, it mentions that her father was a wealthy landowner. He had also been born enslaved. So more questions arise, right? Yeah. And so I was able to track down the land where they had been enslaved and which they had come to own. And it's now owned by the state of Maryland. So my understanding, I still don't totally know how my great-grandfather was able to purchase this land, but somehow he was able to purchase this land. And when he passed away, he left it equally to his children, including Martha Murphy, my great-great-grandmother. So she sold her portion to her brother and used that money to invest in her husband's vision and his business that he had been a part of since the founding, but they didn't own it until 1897.
Oh, that's so beautiful. What a cool story. I'm excited to hear more once you learn more, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely.
I also, we had some questions about the target opening date. I know you just had your groundbreaking, but do you have a target opening date?
We're just saying generally end of the year, because if anybody knows anything about construction, things always take longer. And particularly with a historic building like this one, you're going to uncover some things that you weren't expecting. The budget will likely shift. You know, we're doing pretty well on fundraising, but we still have more money to raise currently. And if things pop up that we weren't expecting, we're going to need a little bit more than that. So it's all kind of contingent on all of those factors.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned the youth archival program that you're partnering with, but if someone is interested in getting involved outside of that and would like to come and do archival work with you all, how would they go about doing that?
Currently, because we're at a site that is not technically a public-facing site, we're only really able to work with our direct program partners. And so, you know, we only have 7 people on our team. We have fairly limited capacity for new partnerships, but we are always trying to find ways to get the collections out. Once we have our own site, people will be able to come and do in-person research there. So that's part of why we're excited to build this new location. But in the interim, Oyinda Omoloja, who I pointed out on the screen on our team, will work with you as a reference archivist to help you find the materials that you're looking for. So we have a few resources that are available remotely from home. I mentioned the Pratt Library's ProQuest subscription that you have access to with the library card. That's a great first start, just to see, did the Afro even write about this topic? That'll help clue you into whether or not we might have more backup documentation about what's written about in the article, right? So if we wrote an article, we might have a photograph, we might have reporter's notes, we might have more content about that topic. So that's a great entry point for learning more about the collection.
Wonderful. Someone also said that I saw that you all have film in the archives. Do you have any plans to record oral histories on people who were helped through the Afro's community projects?
That's a great question. We don't really have a lot of film in the collection. We have some audio recordings, and we have a couple of like VHS tapes and things like that. It's a little piecemeal. But in terms of oral histories, it's definitely on our list. It's something that we would love to do, and we talk about it often. It just comes down to the number of people that we have. So we're actively and always, as a nonprofit organization, fundraising, particularly so that we can increase the staff to be able to do more of these projects. But partnerships are also great places for that kind of work to happen as well. So if we're considering how we might partner with other organizations that do a lot of oral history work to be able to document those stories as well, because there's so many people. When you talk about Afro Clean Block in particular, just last night, we went to a kickoff dinner with our construction team, and we were sitting around the table, and somebody says, you know what, my block won Clean Block, and I was the captain, and all just running down all this information, so there's so many people who have lots of stories and warm feelings about these programs, and some people who have some critiques, but we want to hear it all. We would love to hear it all and to document those things. So in the future, yes. Right now, we're just focused primarily on processing the collection and getting into the building.
Yeah. In kind of a similar vein, someone was saying, can preservation professionals in the area help out in any way? They're saying that they're an archaeologist in the Anne Arundel County area.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing, it would have been great if you wanted to do pro bono archaeology on this project, because we just signed that contract. But we're always looking for people with skills to be able to help. So there are a few projects within the collections that we've flagged already that require preservation specifically. So it's maybe outside the scope of an archaeologist, but the historic doors that we showed on screen, for instance, those have quite a bit of preservation work that needs to happen. We did get a scope of work together, and the next step would be to figure out when we have time to do project management for it and to, raise the funds to get that going. There are also several scrapbooks within the collection that notoriously are preservation hazards, let's say. So there's a lot to work on. It's just right now we have to always prioritize what we're doing. And so right now our priority is getting the collection fully processed in advance of opening the Public Research Center. Once we're there, there's so much more flexibility about our hours, who we can work with and bring in, and just how we can approach those projects.
Yeah, I've got another question. Could you talk about your metadata process and how you catalog such a massive collection?
It's a great question. I wish Megan were here to tell you directly, because she talks to me sometimes and I'm like, okay, Megan, sure. So I don't know all of the details. I'm not a trained archivist, so I'll just start there. What I will say is that there is quite a bit of data that we inherited from a former processing project that happened in maybe like 2008. That was Mellon funded and in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. And so a lot of the work that the processing team is doing now is based on that initial data, but updating it, cleaning it up, and verifying it. And so one thing that I will mention about metadata that I can speak authoritatively to is that we are definitely adding women's names into the collection. And so oftentimes we'll find women cataloged under their husband's names as, Mrs. John Howard or something. And so if we can find their name in the folder, we will include that in the metadata so that we can actually surface their name instead of just having them hidden behind their husbands, for instance.
Yeah, that's very important work for sure. I feel like that is a big gap in a lot of archives and also just historical data, period.
Yeah, it was actually something that came up during the publication project that we did too. So the publication about Black women and the vote, that was a challenge to research, because oftentimes I was looking for somebody and I knew they did particular work, but I couldn't find them. And then I realized, oh, you're hiding in your husband's folder.
Yeah.
Or you've been hidden in your husband's folder.
Yes, you've been hidden. Yeah. Would you mind sharing how Afro Charities acquired the Afro Historic Doors?
I'd be happy to. I have to shout out David Armenti at Maryland Center for History and Culture. He actually alerted us to the fact that these doors were available at an auction that was it was happening in Virginia. And so he, connected us with the rest of the team at MCHC to talk about it. And they basically said, if you guys want to go after it, we'll back off because you should have them. We don't need to have them. We'd love to have them, but if you want them, you should go for them. So Dion and I were both out of town for a conference with one of our funders, but Dr. Draper, who's the CEO and publisher of the AFRO, was able to actually attend the auction in person in Virginia and to bid on the doors. And she came in wearing a big old Afro shirt just to let people know we were in the building and that the doors needed to come with us. But our understanding is that when a huge renovation happened at 628 North Utah, it's now an apartment building. Those doors came off of the building and were in an architectural salvage. And so somebody purchased them and just had them in their apartment. And when that guy passed away, his nephew took them to auction. So on one side, it says NAACP second floor. And then on the other side, it says AFRO 8:30 to 5 p.m., which is pretty cool to understand that these two organizations shared space in this way.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to get those back and be able to have those. And I think this is going to be our last question because of time. How can someone look into the history of an organization, church, or their family through African American Newspaper Archives?
Oh, it's easy once you get the hang of it. It is a little challenging, I will admit, to navigate through the ProQuest system. And I do recommend that as your first stop. We do have a step-by-step guide for that. So if you reach out to archives@afro.com, we use that email because it's just simpler to remember, archives with an S on the end @afro.com. We can send you that step-by-step guide for accessing the collections. And all you need is a library card. So basically you would go in, you would select the Baltimore Afro American if you only want to look at our newspaper as your source. And then you would type in the organization, the church, the family name, and just do a search. And like I mentioned, you can narrow it down by dates. You can narrow it down by whether it has an image or not. So many different ways to kind of filter your search. And that's a good starting point.
Yeah. Thank you again, Savannah, for this important and very engaging presentation. Again, many, many positive chat comments about how important and wonderful this presentation was. So thank you again. And thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4th Century Project. And thank you to Gateway Interpreting for providing accessibility for today's program. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us today. Stay safe, take care, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.